Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending upon when you are watching this lesson. Today we are going to be discussing character. We're going to be looking at the short story Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne and the poem Richard Cory by Edwin Arlington Robinson. So to begin, let's talk about characters. You cannot have a story without a character. Go ahead, try to think of a story that does not involve some kind of character. It's going to be very difficult to come up with one. And if you do come up with one, I can just tell you your third person omniscient narrator is now your character. And there you go. A character is defined in this sense as any person in a work who acts, appears, or is referred to as playing a part. So anybody that is mentioned by name or by description, my brother, my cousin, my mother, the boss, the chairman, the ex-wife, the whatever. Okay, the senator, those are characters. Even if they don't physically appear in the story, they're just mentioned. This all goes it can be summed up by Shakespeare's quote, "All the world's a stage, and we are but its players." Um, that kind of sums up this idea that even people in the background are characters. Characters loom large in fiction. As I said, you can't have a fiction story without characters. Okay. And we care about what happens in a story because it happens to someone. Even if that someone's not a human character, if it is an animal character, we care about what happens to that character. We care about what happens in a story because it's happening to somebody. It's happening to a personified thing. Characters can take on a life of their own. Think about, and Groot is here as the example of this. Think about films or TV shows that you may have watched that have these kind of side characters or characters with smaller parts that then grow into larger characters all on their own that start to take up more of the focal point. These side characters that start to take on a life of their own, much like Groot. Okay, that's why I use him here as the example, as the image here. He started off as just a side background character and grew into a character that now is getting his own story that he's going to be the focal point of. Characters can also distinguish whole genres of work, of literature. If you are unsure what the genre is of your story, look to the characters. If you have cowboys and barmaids and saloon owners and outlaws, you probably are in a Western or you're in Star Wars. Characters must have at least some human quality. They have to be able to think or feel pain or fall in love or speak or display some kind of emotion. This is called personification. When you attribute human qualities to a non human entity within your story, that is personification. The doorknob in Alice in Wonderland speaking, feeling pain when she grabs him too tight to open the door. This is personification. The playing cards in Alice in Wonderland. Basically, everything in Alice in Wonderland. Heroes and villains versus the protagonist and the antagonist. Think of what you know about heroes and villains, okay? Your hero or your heroine, they're considered the good guy of their story, okay? They are a number one focal point, good guy, does no wrong. A lot of times they are larger than life. They are better than most humans. They're godlike, okay? And then on the flip side of that, you have your villain. Your villain is your traditional bad guy or foil to the hero. Also, a lot of times they're larger than life, not necessarily better than most humans. They are the what we call the shadow. So, in terms of archetypes, if you know Carl Jung or Joseph Campbell, you'll recognize the term archetype. But in terms of archetypal characters, this is called the shadow. This is the foil to the hero, the opposite, whatever is standing in the hero's path of completing their mission or completing their story arc. Modern characters are not as black and white as being able to call them heroes and villains. Okay, you have heroes doing villainous things. You have villains doing heroic things. You have heroes like Deadpool, who racks up quite a body count, but he's a hero. Okay, he's considered a hero. And you have villains like Loki, okay, who is a villain, but in several turns is doing heroic things. He's a villain in the Avengers. He's a villain working with the heroes, or the Avengers, the second Avengers, or the second Thor movie, whichever one it is. Where it's the second Thor movie, I guess. But he's a villain that ends up working with the heroes, and then eventually he becomes a hero. That's a different character that we'll talk about in a minute. We use the term protagonist and antagonist instead of hero and villain because these are neutral terms. Okay, so your protagonist then is just your lead character, the focal point of the story, the person whom the story is about, or the person that carries the story on their shoulders. Your antagonist then is the opposition to them. Okay, so your protagonist can be a bad guy. Think of the Joker, the movie that came out, right? You had Joaquin Phoenix played the Joker. The Joker was the protagonist of that, even though he is not a hero, but he's the protagonist of that story. That story was looking at him as the main character. This idea of characterization is deliberate. Authors will deliberately make their characters a certain way, write their characters a certain way, and depict their characters a certain way. And this we know to be true 100% because fictional characters are products. They are created by their authors. They're fictional. Okay? So don't come at me with an example of, well, such and such in their biography was, well, because that's a biography. Those are real people. But even biographies you're not getting told the whole truth of things. Or autobiographies or whatever, or even fictionalized versions of real people. They're still deliberately characterized a certain way. We have two types of characterization, direct and indirect. Direct characterization is when the author explains the personality of the character directly to you. Okay, it defines the character traits of the person by using adjectives. Sarah is beautiful, and she knows it. Tom is arrogant. Belial is intelligent. Muhammad is fast. Whatever the case may be, look for those adjectives. Okay, and the adjectives will kind of indicate to you, hey, this is a direct characterization. Indirect characterization is a little bit harder to decipher sometimes because we have to understand the nature of the character by all these different things here that we are given. So by their thoughts or their speech patterns or their appearance as it's described or their role in the story or their action or inaction depending upon what the story is calling for. And most importantly, the influence they have on the other characters around them. We have to bring our education and our perception and our emotions and our education and intelligence into it and be able to interpret that indirect characterization to come up with what the author, hopefully what the author is intending, and if not, what our interpretation of this character is. A lot of times secondary characters deliver a soliloquy that defines the protagonist, or the protagonist themselves can deliver some kind of a monologue that symbolizes their character. We already watched some of the Hamlet to be or not to be speech, but that's a monologue that would fit in as indirect characterization. That monologue helps us see Hamlet for what he is and the type of character that he's supposed to be. Characters are viewed as a combination of who they are, so the indirect characterization, but we attribute to them. Characters are viewed as a combination of who they are, so how we interpret that indirect characterization, and of how they're written. Okay, so the direct characterization. Here's an example, direct versus indirect characterization. Direct characterization of Mike would be Mike was a poor chap who lived in a small house. Right? We're told he's poor, his house is small. That's what we're told. Directly told that. Indirect characterization doesn't use adjectives, as you can see here, right? Wealth never knocked on Mike's doors. Not only is it indirect characterization, but it's personifying wealth there because wealth can't knock. But to say wealth never knocked on Mike's doors, we have to interpret that statement to mean, oh, okay, so Mike is not wealthy. Mike is not a wealthy man. Rules that govern fictional worlds and therefore the characters in them differ from one another, from genre to genre. The rules that differ, a science fiction story are going to be different than the rules that govern a historical fiction story. Each subgenre has its own rules, but there's variations. Okay, there are always exceptions to every rule. So there's variations to all of these different rules that govern these fictional worlds. The variations that an author gives to us reflects these differences in understanding human nature. Okay, so by taking a cowboy and putting them into space, you're now making a space cowboy. And you're subverting the genre. You're reflecting on the differences between a cowboy and a spaceman. A character who is unchanging in the story. They do not go through character growth or development or change their stance on anything. They remain the same. Is a static character. Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye is the perfect example of a static character. He doesn't change. He doesn't grow. He doesn't become different. He is still the same arrogant kid at the end of the story that he was at the beginning. There is no difference. He is a static character. A dynamic character, then, is the opposite, is a character that goes through character development and goes through some sort of growth and does change and becomes different on the inside, becomes a different person. Um, Again, bringing up Loki from Marvel, right? He starts off as the antagonist, the villain, and by the end of his story arc, he's a hero. So he is a dynamic character. Through these characters and how they interact with our conventions and our beliefs, we learn about our own values and prejudices and beliefs. I briefly mentioned archetypes earlier. Let's just define them real quick. They are typical examples of a certain person or a thing. Your hero, your comic relief, your damsel in distress, your wise old mentor, your father figure, your mother figure. These are common archetypes. They're also called character tropes. I'll refer to them as both archetypes and character tropes, but they pretty much mean the same thing. One of these tropes is like a Luigi. It's me, Luigi. Wah! No, that was not a sound clip. That was actually me. So Luigi is an archetypal character. He's the sidekick. Okay, he is the secondary character. He's who every younger sibling growing up in the '90s was forced to play Mario as. To the point where you got really good at playing as Luigi, and when you played as Mario, you were terrible. Luigi is also an example of a dynamic character, okay, because he started off as just a color variation of Mario and grew into this. He's now a main character. He has his own special abilities. He has his own titles, right? You go from I don't want to be Green Mario playing Super Mario Brothers to I want to play Luigi's Mansion. So he is a dynamic character. He grows and he's busted out of the archetype. He's gone from a sidekick to a hero in his own right. In the end, though, you need to remember this about characters. All characters, no matter how individualized and idiosyncratic they seem, ultimately become meaningful only if they represent something beyond the story. To us, okay? This is the same as when I said literature has to hold artistic value. To who? To us. My definition of what the character represents could be different than yours. To you, it could represent nothing. To me, it could represent everything. To us. And only if that character represents something beyond the story. You're not going to care about a character or what happens to that character if you cannot relate to that character in some way. So that is it for character. Let's move on to Hawthorne. And so that is it for character. Let's move on to Hawthorne and Young Goodman Brown. Nathaniel Hawthorne was an American writer who grew up in New England. He was born and raised in New England in the, as you can see here, the early part of the 17th century, 1804 to 1864. So he was a contemporary of Poe, as I mentioned last time. He comes from a family of Puritans. The reason that we mention that he's from a family of Puritans is because Puritans play in his a large role in his works. Almost all of his works involve around Puritan New England in the 16th century or 17th century. Um, I may have also just said that he lived in the 17th century. I meant the 19th century. Um, I apologize. It has been a long day already. For me, anyway. For you, it's, I don't know, could be 5 minutes into your day. He is the great great grandson of a man named John Haythorne. Now, if you've studied American history or you know anything about the Salem witch trials, that name may sound familiar to you. And the reason for that is because he was one of the top judges during the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials were where American men and women were burned at the stake or hanged or drowned or executed via firing squad for being witches. They were sought after, they were hunted down, many of whom just because they disagreed with the Puritans or they made somebody upset or they said something that somebody didn't like. It's where the term witch hunt comes from. If you're familiar with that term, where somebody goes on a witch hunt. Well, it's the Salem witch trials. We had the McCarthyism right in the 50s where people were looking for communists everywhere. Same thing. And I'm almost certain if I mention anything related to it, that it's going to annoy somebody. But there are plenty of examples of this very same mentality in the world today in 2022. To distance themselves from the black mark of being related to John Haythorne, his father added the W to their last name. His father died in 1808 when Nathaniel was just 4 years old. Um, his mother never remarried. Instead, he and his sisters and his mother moved in with his aunt and her daughters. So Nathaniel Hawthorne was raised in a world with all women, with very few male kind of role models to look up to. And personally, I think that's why he creates such strong, empowered female characters like Hester Prynne from the Scarlet Letter. If you've ever read the Scarlet Letter, that's Hawthorne's major work. That's one of the things that he's most well known for is the Scarlet Letter. That is the story of a Puritan woman who ends up pregnant out of wedlock. She's shunned. She is mocked and ridiculed and threatened. She's forced to spend the rest of her life wearing a red A emblazoned on her chest for adulteress. But all throughout her life, she refuses to be kicked down. She refuses to divulge the name of the father of her child because um, she knows that nothing really will happen to this person anyway because he's a man. And it's only the women that have to be shamed for sex and for enjoying sex. Hawthorne was way ahead of his time with some of these ideas that he had. But she stands up for herself and for her daughter. And Hawthorne, you can see the relation between him and the females in his life just in the way that he writes Hester Prynne. One day in 1813, he was playing a game called bat and ball, which is essentially just baseball or stickball, and he was hit on the leg and injured, and that injury was so severe he was bedridden for an entire year. And it's during that time. Now remember, this is 1813. There was no television. We didn't have phones. There was no radio. There was no internet. There was nothing for him to do but read and write. So this time is really when his passion for writing kind of took off. He went to Bowdoin College in 1821 because he thought that he had to go to college. It wasn't that he wanted to further his education. He was of the idea that that's what he was supposed to do. So that's why he went. He hated it, but he went. And he graduated in 1825. If you look up the Bowdoin class of 1825, you'll see names like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, an American poet, Horatio Bridge, an American naval war hero, William Hale, a senator, David Foster, a composer, The class of 1825 is the most famous class of Bowdoin College, and Hawthorne was a part of that. He was offered an appointment as a weigher and gauger at the Boston Custom House, where he earned a salary of $1,500 a year. He accepted this in January of 1839. You might not think $1,500 a year is a lot, especially when his job basically consisted of looking at a shipping container and saying, I think that weighs half a ton. But that being said, adjusted for inflation, that's about 40 grand. It's over 40 grand. It's almost, it's halfway between 40 and $41,000 a year to guess the weight of things coming off of boats. That's what he did. That was his career. He contributed short stories to lots of different magazines and newspapers, but none of them really drew any kind of attention. And he was okay with that. Because writing was not his job. Writing was his passion. He didn't want to do it professionally. He wanted to do it because he loved to do it. And if it was a profession for him, he wouldn't have enjoyed doing it anymore. So he considered his career to be that he was a weigher and a gauger, and that his passion, his hobby, was writing. His good friend Horatio Bridge offered to kind of front the bill in getting his stories published, and in 1837, he did just that. He published Twice Told Tales, which was his first collection of short stories. He was married, he had 3 children. It's important to know because his son Julian grew up to be a United States Senator and was very prominent during the early part of the 20th century, in or the late part of the 19th century, and kind of getting the country back to where it should have been, kind of post Civil War era, um, and then at the turn of the century. So the publication history for young Goodman Brown, he first published it anonymously in 1835 in New England Magazine. Hawthorne was notorious for publishing his stories anonymously or under pen names at first, because again, he didn't want recognition. He didn't care if people knew that was his story. He just wanted to get his stories out there. He wanted to write. He wanted people to read them. He didn't care if they were attributed to him or not. It was not a career for him. In 1846, so 11 years later, he collected this. He released his second collection, which this is a part of, called Moses from an Old Main. This was the story I was telling you guys about in the last video with Poe, where Poe was actually a fan of this story, saying that it was, quote, the product of a truly imaginative intellect. That's the direct quote from Poe. The product of a truly imaginative intellect. And then again, to remind you guys, when he found out then that it was Hawthorne that wrote it, he said, no one is perfect. We are all allotted one mistake, and I have made mine for my lifetime. Goodman is not the character's name. It is a Puritan title for Mister. Now, we can look at this and we can kind of break it down and say, oh, well, he's called Goodman Brown because he's a good man, because the Puritans also did use the word Mister, um, or master if you weren't married. So, Goodman wasn't necessarily exclusive to meaning Mister. It wasn't the only word they had for it. Hawthorne, again, made the deliberate choice to use it, and we can kind of see the symbolism in using it. So, some historical background. We already talked about Puritan England in the 17th century. And we already talked about the Salem witch trials. Those are kind of the 2 big ones that stick out the most in terms of the historical context of this story. What we don't always talk about is the Puritan intolerance of the Quakers. The Quakers were like Puritan light, in terms of they kind of accepted all people. They're pacifists. They were peaceful. They were the neighbor that everybody gets along with. So for the fact that the Puritans didn't like them, I feel like the Puritans hated the Quakers because the Quakers were better Puritans than the Puritans were. Because the Quakers were actually liked by people. Without the Quakers, you don't have Pennsylvania, you don't have oatmeal. So 2 big things to thank the Quakers for is our states, is our neighbors, and our breakfast. This is also right after King Philip's War, which was a series of wars between the Native American tribes that were living in New England, that had set up and established themselves in New England, tribes that collected under King Philip, who was a Native American leader, and Puritan settlers at the time. So this was again around the 1600s. I love this quote from Oscar Wilde: "Every saint has a past and every sinner has a future." And I feel like it applies to this story and the themes of this story, in that you don't truly know somebody's past, just like you can't truly know somebody's future. For both of these, I have two examples from Christianity, and if you think of more, or you think of anybody outside the realm of Christianity, please shoot me an email or a message and let me know. Like, hey, Professor, I have another example for your every saint, your saint and sinner, past and future analogy. So I bring up Saint Augustine and Saint Paul. Saint Augustine, when he was a child, when he was younger, was into drugs, booze, women, debauchery. The baser, the better, right? He was just banal at the you know pure bestial nature, right? Animal nature, that animal brain taking over. And by the time he died, he had converted to living a very religious life and a very devout life. So you see the past of the saint and the future of the sinner, right? Because everything he was doing as a child would have been considered a sin by the church standards. And then the other one, as I said, is St. Paul, who was born Saul. He was a Roman, and he persecuted Christians, right? He killed more Christians than probably anybody else at the time. And as the story goes, he's riding to Damascus, and Jesus appears to him, and he's blind. But in being coming blind, he sees the error of his ways and converts, and again becomes a very devout Christian. And both men end up becoming saints. But it plays into Wilde's quote here: "Every saint has a past, every sinner has a future," which I feel, like I said, plays into this story. Quickly to go over the themes, the hypocrisy of Puritanism. That's the big one. That's what Hawthorne's trying to point out. Now, that's not to say that in 1839, or 1835 rather, when the story was published, that there were still Puritans running amok. They had pretty much died out. Um, but think of Hawthorne as being critical of all kinds of fanatical religions and all kinds of just fanatical belief structures and people that fanatically believe in something, as he was wont to do, as he used the Puritans in 17th century New England to do so. Um, he does so by showing the hypocrisy, and that this whole Puritan town shows up for this devil ceremony. Losing faith and innocence, that one's pretty self explanatory if you've read the story and you know who Faith is. Saints versus sinners, we kind of went over here. And again, Goody Cloyce is one of those characters that's mentioned in the story that we see. She teaches catechism to the young kids, but she's at this black mass, right? She's at this satanic ceremony. Nature and the supernatural, and family and individual choice. So for family and individual choice, the stranger that Brown meets up with in the woods mentions his father and his grandfather and says, I've done business with them before. Let me do business with you, carry on the family tradition. And Goodman Brown says no. Right? He says, no, I'm my own man. I'm going to make my own decisions. I have to follow my faith. My faith says that you're no good, and I'm not going to get into business with you. I'm sorry. Now, by the end of the story, he makes the opposite choice, but some would argue that he's kind of forced to do that, so that there's more of an illusion of choice than an actual choice. But he does even make the illusion of choice. Now, I have a film to show you. Now, you can choose to watch it. You can choose not to watch it. If you choose not to watch it, you can once I stop talking, once I tell you that I'm going to start the video, you can skip ahead about 8 minutes or so. Um, it is a student film. It's a short independent film adaptation of Young Goodman Brown. It's a modernized version of it. They take out a lot of things because it's only 8 minutes. But here is your warning for this. There is a brief snippet of nudity. Very brief. There are some scary images. And I put this in here because I have had students complain that I'm showing videos depicting satanic rituals for a story that depicts a satanic ritual. So be forewarned, there is a satanic ritual in this 8-minute long video. I'm going to play it now.
Daniel Brown was a good Christian man. As he went to the church that night, he thought of his wife. She begged him not to go, but he said he had work to prepare for Sunday.
Wake up, sleepyhead. We're gonna be late for service. Daniel. Daniel, that's a stop sign. Are you okay?
I didn't sleep well last night.
Good morning.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You look beautiful.
We'll see you in there. All right.
Good morning.
I'll see you later. Oh, bye. You're probably going to.
Hey, you two.
Hi, good morning.
Morning. Hey, we should get in there. Worship's about to start.
Yeah, someone likes to sleep in.
Late night?
All right, honey, let's go. Daniel, what is it? Honey, you've been acting funny all morning. What's going on?
Where was I last night?
What do you mean?
Where was I?
You're at home with me, silly. Come on, we're gonna be late.
I'll be in a minute.
Daniel Brown lived a good Christian life. He gave much of his time and money to the church. But it is said by some of the people who knew him best that somewhere along the way he had lost his faith.
So I hope that I play these videos and I put them in here in hopes that it'll kind of help if you didn't really get a clear picture of what was going on. Um, that it kind of helps and it kind of makes a little bit more sense. If you watched it, if you chose not to watch it, then just move on. I mean, we're gonna go right into Edwin Arlington Robinson, who is our Edwin Arlington Robinson, who's our poet for this lesson. He's an American poet. Pretty much in the world of literature, he was a poet. He didn't write stories or anything like that. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 3 times, which is an amazing feat. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature 4 times, which is also an amazing feat. So, the two major prizes that you, as a writer, you can win, he won them both multiple times. He was born in Head Tide, Lincoln County, Maine. Lived in Maine his whole life. Moved around Maine, but he lived in Maine. That's where he was primarily from. An interesting story about Edwin Arlington Robinson is that he wasn't named until he was 6 months old. So this was at the time where few children, if any, were born in hospitals. So he probably would have been born at home. And you could go 6 months without naming your child. Now, before that kid is even out, you're filling out a birth certificate. And that's their legal name. Which is why my friend's name is technically BB, because his birth certificate says his name is Baby Boy, because they didn't know what his name was going to be. So we call him BB. Because until he was 18 years old, his name was legally his first name was Baby Boy. And then at 18, he changed it to his first name was what his middle name was. Well, what we called him, but anyway. His parents desperately wanted a girl, and they kind of resented the fact that they had a boy. So that's part of the reason why they didn't name him until he was 6 months old. They were at a resort for a holiday, for a vacation, and other people that were vacationing there decided that this baby needs a name. You can't just keep calling it a baby. Okay, he needs to have a name. So they collected a whole bunch of names into a hat, and Edwin was the one that was selected. So that became his first name. The man that pulled the name Edwin out of the hat was from Arlington, Massachusetts. So that then is how he got the name Edwin Arlington. He hated his name. He hated his name, and he hated his parents for naming him that, because names are supposed to mean something. And this one was just arbitrarily and randomly picked. So he used to sign everything E.A. Robinson. I'm going to play a poem, an audio clip of a poem, over an image of Richard Cory. It's an artist's depiction of Richard Cory. It's not an actual Richard Cory. It's not an actual person. So stick around and listen to it, and just check out the image before you move forward. There is a quiz on Young Goodman Brown. There is an essay on Richard Cory. I will see you next time. We will be discussing Setting, Children of the Corn, which is a little bit long, so give yourself enough time to finish reading it. And London. It has been a change to the syllabus. It is London by William Blake. It is not Harlem by Langston Hughes. It is London by William Blake. That's for next time. And remember, be good people.
Richard Cory by Edwin Arlington Robinson. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said, "Good morning," and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything, to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat, and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet in his head.